Hi and welcome. My name is Francesca Isabel del Rosario, but you can call me Francesca or Chesca for short. Today I will explain to you about mobile photography. So, your phone is like a portable camera that can fit in your pocket. You can open a camera and take pictures anytime. However, this doesn't mean you can just point and shoot. It's not that simple. So, I will explain to you what you can do in mobile photography. I will explain to you the three elements of exposure or the exposure triangles. These are known as the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So keep in mind, I think it's better if you balance all these three so you can have the ideal image that you want to take. So I will start off with the aperture. This can be written in numbers and f-stops like f1.4, f2, f2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and more. So lower f-stops give more exposure, while higher f-stops give less exposure. In more simpler terms, I guess you can say the aperture can be like your eye and how your iris adapts to bright and dark places or any environment that you're in. So I will explain to you how the aperture can affect the depth of field. So depth of field is a zone of acceptable sharpness in front of and behind the subject in which the lens is focused. Simply put, how sharp or blurry the area behind your subject is. So the lower f-stops is the blurrier the background, while higher f-stops is sharper the background. So it just depends if you want your subject to be more focused in the image. So here I've shown you a example. While wide lenses makes the background blurrier, while narrower lens makes background sharper. So usually it depends on how you want your picture to be taken. So you might be wondering, what's the best aperture I can use in a photo? So I suggest, if you're gonna use portrait pictures, I suggest choosing a large aperture like f2.8, so it can create a shallow depth of field with only the subject or just a portion of the subject in focus. So if you're doing a landscape photography, I suggest maybe using a higher f-stop like f8 or f11, so it can give much detail as possible from the foreground to the background. So if you want to achieve maximum depth and field by choosing a small aperture, while we can get the maximum or minimum depth by working at each end of the aperture range, sometimes we want a more intermediate level of depth of field, limiting to a specific range of distance within the overall photograph. So if you want to balance both the subject and the background, I suggest using a mid-range f-stop like f5.6 or somewhere around there. It really depends. You can adjust it and see what you're more comfortable with. So next is the shutter speed. So these are usually measured in seconds or in fractions. So shutter speed is the length of time that the film is exposed to the scene you're photographing. Similarly, in digital photography, shutter speed is the length of time that your image sensor sees the scene you're attempting to capture. So you'll probably need shutter speeds like 1/60th or of a second or faster. This is because anything slower than this is very difficult to use without getting the camera shake. If you're using a slow shutter speed or anything lower over 1/60, you will need a tripod or anything that can keep the camera still. So if you want to freeze movement in an image, you'll want to choose a faster shutter speed. To let the movement blur, you'll want to choose a slower shutter speed. The actual speed you should choose will vary depending upon the subject and how much the subject moves. So I've showed you here an example. As you can see, the subject gets blurrier and blurrier. 1/500 is very sharp. 1/125 is kind of okay. 1/60 is the subject's blurred, while 1/15 is really blurry. So what's the ideal shutter speed? What shutter speed can you use? So here's just some examples. 1/4 is perfect for people passing by on the streets, like you just see people walking by and you want to take a picture. Next is the 1.8, which is nice for moving water like rivers or waterfalls. While 1/15 is good for people who are running or jogging by the park. And 1/150 is used for general wildlife, like you want to take a picture of a turtle in a beach or you want to take a picture of a deer in a forest. And 1/1000 is for sports, like athletes running in the field or capturing cars and other moving vehicles. And lastly is 1/4000, which is used to capture very fast subjects like birds that are flying by. So the question is blur always a bad thing? Does the subject have to be sharp all the time? Not really. It really depends on how you want your picture to be taken. While using the right shutter speed can help prevent unintended blur, it can also introduce a number of amazing effects by intentionally blurring the images. Blur in the right spot helps add sense of motion to a still photograph. When photographing a race car, for example, many photographers choose a speed that's fast enough to blur the tiles, while keeping the body of the car sharp. So next is last of the elements of exposure is the ISO. In simpler terms, the ISO is a camera option that will either brighten or darken your photograph. Increasing the ISO number will make your picture brighter and help you capture good shots in darker environments. So you may be wondering, what does the ISO stand for? It stands for the International Organization of Standardization, a group that has created tens of thousands of technology and product standards, including those for film sensitivity. It still is a camera setting, but playing with it can give your photographs a different look. There's always a trade-off between higher ISO value and the noise level of a photo shoot. So you might be wondering, what noise am I talking about? So here's a picture. As you can see, as the ISO value goes up, your picture becomes more noisy and grainy, something like sandpaper. And usually it makes the photo useless and not really good for presentation. So what to do in ISO is you should only raise it when you're unable to brighten the photo via shutter speed or aperture. While we always say you should use the base ISO whenever possible, we also know that's rarely possible. Lighting conditions vary as much as the subject we photograph, and for that reason, you'll probably need to adjust your ISO often. So I showed you an example on what ISO to use in different places like daylight, shade indoors, flash indoors, darken indoors, indoors at night, and extra low light. So you might have any questions about these. So what are the lighting conditions? Is it sunny outside? Is your subject well lit, or is it dark or overcast? So you might want to adjust your ISO for that. Next is, can your image handle a certain amount of grain or noise? Some photographs like to keep a certain amount of grainness to their images for the artistic moodiness it creates. So yes, you should really balance it out. So next is, are you using a tripod? If so, you have more options when it comes to the shutter speed. Therefore, you have options when it comes to the ISO. Lastly, is your subject in motion? Are you shooting moving objects that you want to freeze? So understanding the meaning of ISO will go a long way towards getting your camera out of auto and taking full control of your art. To fully master exposure, the best thing you can do is to experiment and try it yourself. So here's a summary of the three elements. The aperture is the sharpness of a photo of the subject or the background. The shutter speed is to able capture subject in clear or blurry view. And the ISO can help you photograph in dark places. However, again, like I said earlier, the noise or the grain in the photo. Too much can make the photo not look well. So I guess that's all I can show you. So thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something. And if you're interested in the sources, here are the links that I used. And if you want to learn more about this, you can go to these links and teach yourself on how to take more better photos. So again, thank you for listening.